The following content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute means for diagnosis, healthcare advice, nor treatment. Make use of a qualified healthcare professional for such purposes.
I finished school, I went to work for the Tuscaloosa County Public Defender. Prior to that, in my bachelor's, I was set on aging veterans. That's what I wanted to do. And so I interned and did geriatric psych. After doing that, I love geri psych. That's what I wanted to do. I was set on geri psych, start my master's. And I noticed all of my focus and attention was going to incarceration and forensic psych type stuff. So I interned with St. Elizabeth's in Washington, D.C. on their forensic units. And so that's where that kind of started manifesting a little bit. And then when I first got out of school, I applied for 40 or so jobs. And I ended up going to work for the Tuscaloosa County Public Defender. From there, I got a call that I was being considered for a job at William Donaldson Correctional Facility that I had actually applied for about a year before. And so I knew that that was what I wanted to, like, I wanted to work inside. I wanted that experience. So I went and worked on the mental health units there. There's a lot there, and I'll kind of talk about it a little bit and some reasons of why I left there and moved on to other things. So I did work at Taylor Hardin Secure Medical Facility for a little while. I was there for about a year, and I got a call that I was being recommended for the job with the Federal Defender's Office. I have since part-time started working for Joanne Terrell, who is a clinical social worker out of Tuscaloosa. She has the Mitigation Resources of Alabama. She's, if you look her up or don't know who she is, she's probably one of like the founding people doing death penalty mitigation in Alabama. So I've started doing some death penalty cases on the side, and I can do that since those are state cases and my federal cases are non-capital. This I really wanted to touch on because everything that I've done has led into what I'm doing next or what I'm doing now. And so when I worked for the Tuscaloosa County Public Defender's Office, I was their social worker. One of my first cases was a 16-year-old female that was being charged as an adult. So as long as you were at least 15 and a half at the time of your arrest in the state of Alabama, the cop at that moment can make the decision to take you to county or take you to juvie. The arresting officer in this case was also the officer that sent her dad to prison. He took her to county. She was charged with assault 1. It was drama. It was teenage drama. Her girlfriend's getting harassed by some dude by text message. And so they came up with a setup. They were like, well, we're going to teach him a lesson. He's not going to come around. He's not going to mess with you. So the client and one other friend go to meet this guy, and the guy ends up taking off running when the victim shows up. My client hits him with a baseball bat. The victim was injured. The victim did go to the hospital. The victim did not sustain any serious injuries. The police officer that was arresting in this case was going for a sentencing. He wanted this child to be sentenced. I did not want this child to be sentenced. I met with her. She was very ADHD, never treated for it. And so when it comes to this stuff, we have to look at like the investigative needs. These are things that I do. These are things that investigators do. The public defender's offices have investigators that do these things as well. But we want to look at family interviews. We want to look at, she's so young, we want to look at school records. School personnel has to know her very well at this point. Church members, anyone in the community, next door neighbors, which happened to all be her family. They all lived very close. Since she was so young, the most important thing in this were the school records. That was kind of the hallmark of everything. This female client, she had continually just been kind of passed through classes. She had failing grades on every single report card, but it was pass, pass, pass. So that's where my social work brain starts coming in, and I'm like, this doesn't make sense. This child's just being moved through. So I call the school. They're like, oh, she's just a troublemaker. I'm like, well, what else can you tell me about her? Because I know that's not all that's like about her. And was able to get in with someone that taught the special education classes, and they were like, she's severely ADHD. She's difficult. It's hard to do this stuff, but like she can do it. But they keep passing her through because no one wants to have her in their class again. These are things I was able to take to the judge. These are things I was able to kind of put into a report, put theories to it, because we know those theories are so important when we talk about childhood development, attachment. Again, her dad had been in prison her entire life. The arresting officer is the officer that had her dad arrested in his original case that sent him to prison. So we were able to come up with a report, attach the theories to it, present it to the judge, present it to the DA's office, and come up with a plan. So I was able to, again, the social work part, I was able to work with a local group in Tuscaloosa called Tuscaloosa's One Place, or One Roof is what's in Birmingham. They're all very similar. We were able to get her released from the jail. She immediately began GED classes because we knew, okay, she can do the work, but she's failing. So like school structure doesn't work for her. That's not going to do anything for her, keeping her there. We were able to get her into job training classes. The mother, she was a very young mother, and they did have trouble with parenting and things like that. They bickered a lot. It was more like sisters when they were, like arguing about something. So we did parenting classes. The mother and the client were able to go into a group therapy together and work with other people. And she was ordered to monthly drug screens. They ended up setting her sentencing out for a year, and she was successful. They were able to close the case on a youthful offender status, but also youthful offender can come back up in a client's future. But this one specifically will have that designation that shows all the work that she put in to have that cleared out. So this was one of my favorite ones. I'm the person that said, I'm never going to work with children. I'm never going to. Children don't want to do that. And this was one of my favorite cases that I worked on. So another one that was a little bit, I think I used 3 specifically from when I was at the public defender's office, because these were kind of the things that really started striking my interest of what was going on inside the prisons. So I had a 33-year-old male client who was charged with murder. The client and his pregnant girlfriend were living with the girlfriend's family. The girlfriend's brother did have a documented history of violence. There was a dispute. A gun was involved, and our client had shot the brother and killed him. We went to trial, and that's kind of when I started working with the client, was during the trial phase, one, to prepare him for trial. So that was another like kind of cool thing about that job, is being able to work with people and explain these things to them, because competency in the courts can be a double-edged sword. You don't learn anything about the courts in school. You don't learn that stuff growing up. A lot of this stuff, even me going into it and trying to tailor my education towards it, I still had to learn a lot. It was like going to law school. Every time I've done anything legal, it's like going to law school and just reading everything. So getting to share this with clients that don't quite understand, like, why is this person saying this, or what's going on here? So we ended up The jury came back with manslaughter. From that point is when my work mostly came in, was for the sentencing. So how are we going to present this to the judge? Because the state wanted 20 years or more. So, oh, I'm sorry, this one was a 30-year one. The state wanted 30 years imprisonment for this client. We didn't want that. I've been working with this client. Prior to this incident, he was productive. He was working. He was living life, doing everything right, you know, and then this one incident happened, and it's tragic. It is, but that doesn't mean that he can't be outside and be productive and stay out of trouble and all those things. So started doing some collateral interviews. I learned about his upbringing. Again, there's some issues with the dad, and there's some attachment issues and some things that just kind of like manifested where you see how he views males, adult males. Then things, you know, again, men are taught not to talk about the problems, they're taught not to talk about all these things that have happened to them, anything like that. Things do go unsaid, and it's pulling that stuff out. And that's where I found out that he had a girlfriend about 2 years prior that was pregnant. Their apartment, they were living in a pretty bad area in town. The apartment was invaded, and the girlfriend was knocked down on the ground, specifically on her stomach, and she lost the baby. And the client was being beaten at the time and was unable to do anything. So even after that, there was like, he couldn't help her because he was so beaten up. So we were able to talk about the trauma, his sentencing, and talk about, you know, the PTSD and that altercation between the brother and his girlfriend, everything that kind of led to that. The judge ended up sentencing him to a 15-year split, and he went into the Department of Corrections, and we stayed in touch because I was still working in that office. He'd write me letters, and I mean, we know what's going on in the prison system. We see it in the news. And then hearing it from the client, that's where my like wheels really started turning, where I was like, that's where I want to be. Like, I want to be inside an institution. I want to learn this firsthand. The client, luckily, and he did great. He was released onto parole in March of this year. He's doing great. He has a job. He's established his parental rights, his visitation with his kids. He's doing everything right. Whereas the state wanted to sentence him to 30 years. And he's out now. He's on parole, and doing well. So with the Department of Corrections, I took my job there. I knew it was going to be bad. I knew it was going to be awful in there. I watched all the documentaries. I did. You know, there's documentaries on Donaldson Correctional Facility specifically. I watched that one in college, and I was like, I want to go there. So then I took the job there, started my first day, and then I was like, Erika, what are you doing? I don't know if I'm ready for this or anything, but then I loved it at the same time. That's where I wanted to be. And I guess too, there was like this weird part of it where we know that people that are mentally ill can be sentenced. We know that they can be someone that's mentally ill can be competent. They can go to prison. And, you know, anytime that I would talk about working in mental health and corrections, well, it would kind of turn into a conversation of, oh, well, you probably just deal with personality disorders. You probably just like depression or like adjustment disorder, you know, because they're in prison. I'm like, no, these people are severely mentally ill. I'm working with people with severe schizophrenia that hasn't been medicated in years, bipolar, all these things. And so, and then you have the drug issues and everything. And so there's two things that like always stick out in my mind. And that's not just being on the inside, but being out here too, is, you know, that the client be competent to proceed in cases, but what about the clients that don't get quality legal representation? What about the clients that don't get mental health evaluations? What about the clients that don't get these background interviews to find out all this stuff? What about the clients that are children getting sentenced to prison and that mental illness might have not manifested at this time? It might not be there. Those were two huge things that I kind of have that stick out in my mind and that I like to talk to people about, because so frequently it does come down to that. Oh, you just there's a personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder. That's all it is. And there's a lot of it. There's a lot of it, but there's still a huge population of people with serious mental illnesses. So I had a couple patients that I wanted to talk about, and these were kind of some hallmark ones that really stuck out to me. These were also some of my most favorite people ever. I worry about them every day. I still text people to check on them, those that are still working there. So I had this one client that, so I guess I know this is all out of order. I'm not really an in-order person, but so I received a request from an officer to meet with an inmate who was behaving oddly, throwing feces and urine, all these things. So I was like, all right, take me out there. We'll go meet with him. And I was like, we got to put him on crisis. We put him on crisis. And that's when he becomes my client. And I really start working with him and follow him through the transitional phase. I do the interviewing with him, not very, very guarded, not one to really talk at all. It took probably 8 months to get a lot of solid stuff. So I was having to do my research on him. So I'm doing my research on him and I'm reading his files, and he has a robbery. He has 2 robbery 1 charges. And they threw in some theft of property because there was about a total of $417 stolen. A robbery 1 is a Class A felony and can carry a sentence of 20 years to life. But that's with a deadly weapon. This client was sentenced to 198 years for his deadly weapon being a cup of coffee at 2 different convenience stores. And that was like a blow. Like that, when I read that, and then I was seeing how he was being treated in there and all that kind of stuff, I'm like, we've got to do more digging. Like there's more to it. And it ended up, he grew up in foster care. He was considered mentally ill when he was a child. He was diagnosed all over the place. Schizophrenia, bipolar as a young child, heavily medicated at times, not medicated at others. He grew up in juvenile type settings. He had a history of violence. When he turned 18, that was it. He was out on his own, and then he was homeless. So he was homeless from the time that he was 18 to 24, and the client's never had anything of his own. So we understand the theft. I never want anyone to get harmed, and I would never look at this in a situation that, the victim, I would never victim shame, anything like that. But we have to weigh those things. What was the victim impact? And I hope that victim in the case did go through some type of therapy, anything like that, because that is traumatic to get robbed, because you don't know if it's going to be a cup of coffee getting thrown at you or a deadly weapon. And so, but this client was a case of, all right, this is your deal. You get 98 years for the 2 of these, and then you get X amount of years for these, comes out to 198. You might get parole. Well, you're only going to get parole if you do well in the prison. And he's not doing well in the prison. So that's patient A. Patient B is another one that one of my most favorite patients that I've had. He was incarcerated for capital murder. He was sentenced to life without parole because his IQ was under 70. However, the interesting thing about this one is he was 40 at the time of his offense. His offense was very serious. He shot and killed his mother, stepfather, and brother, who were all trying to help get him out of the house and get emergency services because they were afraid to call the police on him. And it didn't go well, and the client tested positive for cocaine when he was taken into the jail. Do my research, go through a lot of his defense is he was high when he committed this crime. He was high. Well, he had a documented history of schizophrenia. Did he have a mental health evaluation? No. But you know what? We can plea you down because your IQ is a little bit low, but it's not, like the hallmark number that we need. So you won't get the death penalty, but you'll go to prison for life. You'll be taken care of. That's what I hear so much. You'll be taken care of. You'll have a place to live. They feed you. You don't have to worry about anything. The one brother was okay with this because he knew that this client of ours would have become his responsibility to take care of. The client, he did have the lower IQ. The client was severely schizophrenic. He went many years unmedicated at times, many years using drugs at times while in prison. At the point that he became my client, his brain's pretty shot. It took a long time of working with him to get him to talk to me and find out things about him. And so again, that social work part, but that building rapport with your client, I was able to learn about a son that he had out there. Turns out the son of another colleague of mine knew the son's mom, but she didn't know this whole background stuff. And so we been able to do some slow reunification stuff over time. So I'm not there anymore, but I mean, this man, he was so isolated, he had no one left. He had no family. So while he was serving his time in prison, why take my medication? Why do good? I'm in here for life, all this kind of stuff. And when I had met him in the prior year, he had already attempted to take his own life 14 times. And in the time that I was working with him, he didn't go on crisis once. So, another just one of those hallmarks, but somebody that he has a heinous crime, but not somebody that would survive in prison, not somebody that needs to live out the rest of their days in a prison setting. Mental health setting, like when I worked at Taylor Hardin, I'm like, oh, I wish I could just go get them and bring them here, get them into group homes one day and all those things. But they do go to prison, and that comes from system failures, poor legal representation, bias, all those things. The third patient that I really wanted to touch on, his was really interesting. He was 24 at the time of his offense. He was also acquitted not guilty he pled not guilty by reason of mental defect, but he was awaiting an evaluation in the state. I worked there. I worked at Taylor Hardin. I know how long that waiting list is and how long people are waiting to get in there. And in that meantime, even though someone's already pled not guilty by reason of mental defect, they can change their mind. The court can say, okay, we're going to put you on this waiting list. You're going to go to a state facility. We're going to get you competent again. But if you change your mind and you want to go ahead and get it over with, they're like, oh yeah, let's clear this out. Let's get this over with. And this is the prime example of where that happened with him. So, I want to say it was in 2012 when the offense happened. And so in early 2015, he's waiting to go to a state facility. So he wrote a letter to the judge requesting to be sentenced to life without parole. And he wrote to the judge, and this is all published information. He wrote to the judge, and there's certain things that we can pick out from it. Where I don't want to read the whole thing since I know it's up there, where he says, I feel a head exam is extremely necessary in my case. He talks about being anxious. He mentions I cannot explain all of my thoughts at the time of this tragic incident because there were so many of them. He even says, I was not of sound mind. They move forward with the case. They give him life without parole. So they give him the deal of life without parole. You don't have to have the death penalty. He was very religious. He didn't want the death penalty. And he went in for life without parole. when I got there, the patient, he was described as being extremely violent, requiring 4-way restraints. So I worked with him, and after 6 months, we had him able to come to group. I had him on a plan where he could verbalize to me that he was safe and that he could come out for stuff. If he told me, it was like the magic word, and I'd say, no, stay there. Don't want you to get in trouble, because I wanted him to have the opportunity that one day, if he ever did try to appeal or do something to get out of that situation, because again, another great case for someone that doesn't need to be there. I wanted him to be able to have that. Wanted him to stay out of trouble. And so I continually worked with him. I continually did my digging. And that's where I found in his record that he went to Shelby Mental Health a few weeks prior to his offense, and stated that an FBI agent across the street from the bus pointed something at him and shot a tiny chip through his eye. And that's the day he started hearing voices. However, after the incident, after everything was found, they took him to the jail and he tested positive for cocaine. We see this a lot. So it's a small town, and he was prosecuted heavily, and his mental health history wasn't taken into account. He could have had a mental health evaluation done by someone privately. There's organizations out there that help with funds for those kind of things. And so he was one of those cases that, he had a heinous crime, but prison's not the place. That's not what's going to fix it. That's not what's going to fix him. Okay, so, and I know I touched a little bit about the things I do at different places. So come into the federal defender's office. Again, this, after really kind of getting into the forensic mental health stuff, I knew that I wanted to work in mitigation, working in the prison system, and seeing those sentences and working with these people. As much as I didn't want to leave there, and I knew that this was my next calling. I knew that this was going to be the next thing for me, but I didn't feel ready for it. So I was terrified going into it. Not gonna lie, I was absolutely terrified. And so really what I do in this job is I do mitigation reports. So I do like the biopsychosocial assessments. I work with people from our expert list. So Dr. Siemens on our expert list, I use him a lot. And I work with him a good bit on stuff, because he can, I don't do the clinical testing. I don't do all of that part. I get more of that background information. Our psychologists do that as well. But then I also work with that person, and then I also work with the attorney to explain to them what all this report means, so that it can be accurately represented in court. So I do like the abbreviated reporting. I'll have an attorney come to me and say, there's something wrong. I don't quite know what it is that's wrong. You talk to them. I'll go in and talk to the client. Sometimes I find out, I'm like, we don't want to do an evaluation on this one. It's going to come back and it's not going to look so good. And then there's ones I'm like, we need an evaluation, or there's ones where I'm like, we have a ton of mitigating factors. We have a ton of stuff we need to look at from this person's childhood history. And if there's any mental health there, we'll look at getting an evaluation done so that we can have the treatment recommendations to back up my recommendations for the judges. So sometimes I do just brief reporting, and then sometimes it's full 15, 20 page reports on the client. So with that does come testifying in court. And I recommend not even just being like on the forensic side of anything in your career. I always recommend testimony skills, looking into those, researching those, watching videos on those, because let me tell you, I can talk all day. I can be so supportive of the client, but I'm also someone that I get really fired up and I have a hard time holding it back. And in court, when someone's asking you lots of questions that they already know the answer to, it's really frustrating, right? Or when they're trying to contradict you and it seems like they're talking down to you, I have a really hard time with that. So that's something I always recommend to everyone. So even with the mitigation reports, mitigation comes out of substance abuse assessments. I do a ton of substance abuse assessments. Our treatment centers are so backed up, try to come up with alternative plans to work with the client, get them into whether they do need mental health counseling as well as substance use treatment. Sometimes we got to go with outpatient, even when the client needs inpatient. We got to get a little bit creative. And again, it all comes from the client interviewing, and it all comes from that treatment planning and continuing to treatment plan. What is going to be attainable for this client that they can do next, where they can do it on their own, where I can give them these resources and they can move forward with it. And so it can still be a little bit clinical. It's still very legal based, but it can still be very clinical when it comes down to it. And so I did include a slide about just a couple, things that I would say within the last 7-8 months that I've kind of worked on with attorneys. With the federal government, they do have a guidelines range of sentencing. It's a recommended guideline. Judge can always go below, they can always go above. The judge can do whatever they want to do when it comes down to it, but they have the guideline range to try to make it fair. And so, for example, I did a full mitigation report in a case. The guideline range was 18 to 24 months. The judge ended up going with middle of the guidelines to a 21-month sentence, which is still a success for the client. That mitigation is still so important because we knocked off a couple months for him. We had another one, and this one, it was a very compelling one, but his guideline range was 87 to 108 months. And we got the judge down to 41 months in the sentencing. So when we look at that, that's years that we saved him from getting. And there was a lot of mitigation and a lot of interviews that went into that one. And so when I said that, I know earlier I talked about, attaching some theories to stuff prior, but now having this clinical license, I'm able to do a little bit more with, don't diagnose, but, can do a little bit more with the theories and explaining those and putting more of that research into it for the court, for the attorneys. Most recently, we had another one that was a guideline range of 70 to 87 months. And the client, we went for 60 because there was a lot of mitigation there, but the client did have a violent case that was pending in state court. Judge went with 77 months, but was going to let it run concurrent with anything that he receives in the state versus putting them back to back. So again, that also saves with years, even just getting that little component. I've had a judge go with max of the guidelines, but it'll run concurrent with whatever's going on over here. And that still saves the client from years because they're not having to run something back to back consecutively. So for an example of with the substance abuse assessments, we had a client that he relapsed on supervision. He was revoked. So the judge in this one was a particularly tough judge. We do have those. We have ones that are called time machines because they really pack on the time. And this client specifically, we were honestly really thinking that the judge was going to send him back to prison for 5 to 11 months. After doing an assessment with him, and he did have a pretty serious drug problem with, he had a serious drinking problem, and he had a serious marijuana and cocaine issue. But I knew that this client, if we sent him to inpatient treatment, he was going to walk out of there. And sometimes that's just the fact of the matter. I can't force someone to do something, but I can get creative, come up with something else and see if it sticks. So that again comes with that background interviewing and really getting to know your client and what's going to work for them. And so we came up with that plan. I spoke to his job. They said, yeah, we'll take him back. The second he gets out, he can come down here, submit a drug test, and he's back on board. Got him in with an intensive outpatient program at UAB. The judge actually ended up continuing his sentence for 6 months to allow him this time to give it a try, to go with my plan and give it a try. And so the client is still currently working full time. I spoke to the treatment center last week, and he'll be done in about a month. And so we'll be able to kind of resume with it and see, is the judge going to let him kill paper, or is he going to stay on supervised release? All this kind of stuff. So yeah, that's kind of what I've put together on the PowerPoint. So my biggest closing thing would be anything that we do with clients, whether it's in these situations or not, that rapport is so important, that working with the client is so important, even when you're working with attorneys or working with facilities or programs or anything. What's important is that working with the client. And I know so much from working inside facilities and working under people that they have needs and wants too of what they want to see coming out of this. They want something to happen very quickly, or they want to see these like positive outcomes or these kind of things. But what's important is the client, what the client needs and what the client can realistically do. And the being able to describe your client well and those kind of things. Again, you know, when it comes down to it at the end of the day, especially in this field, like I said earlier, it's so much easier for someone to get a heavy sentence when the judge doesn't know who they are. And I'm going to say 9.5 times out of 10, the judge doesn't know who they are. And that's why fields like these are so important, because we are doing that work to help people, but also help these system issues.
Questions, any comments, any concerns about anything that Ms. Marsh has presented to us today? Any questions, or what stood out of her presentation that you can mention?
Like in court, when you do go into all this history and stuff, do you usually still get hard line prosecutors and judges that don't really care that much? Like, how much resistance do you think that they give you?
The resistance coming from the prosecution side is always going to be very high. And, you know, even no matter like sticking to your guns and sticking to your ground about things, you're still going to feel a little bit defeated at the end of the day. And then you're going to feel, I would say my biggest thing coming out of those things, or when the prosecution makes a statement about something about mental health, or, well, they never got help, so obviously there's nothing wrong with them and they're just trying to do this now. Those are the questions, those are the statements, you know, those are the statements that really hurt, because you can't really respond to the statements, you can only respond to the questions. And so, and there is a lot of that in the court system, because that's another thing when it comes down to the court system and you're working with adults, these people are being looked at as, you're an adult, you should know better. Why are you here?
Well, I want to thank you for sharing that knowledge and sharing that perspective, that social workers, people in mental health don't necessarily have to do the one-on-one stereotypical lay on the couch, tell me how to
Yeah.
be your mother type of situation, right?
Yeah.
It does involve other areas of application. So not only research instrumental,
Yeah.
and not laying on the couch, tell me how much you hate your mom, more about there's other applications that we can do. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.